Not that I'm aware of. This is really unprecedented, and it's an extraordinary moment in our history. So it makes sense that we're having such a dramatic impact on how everybody's thinking as a citizen and as a consumer.
What if we told you that brands such as Coca-Cola, Lay's, and Jack Daniels are disappearing from the shelves of Canada's largest supermarkets, from Toronto to Vancouver? What if this were not due to an economic crisis or a pandemic, but rather a conscious choice made by millions of people who are tired of depending on their southern neighbor? Do you think this is just marketing? You're wrong. This is the new commercial reality of North America.
Like all good Canadians, I'm trying my best to buy Canadian at the grocery store. But made in Canada, prepared in Canada, I know just looking for a maple leaf probably isn't good enough. So my question is, how do I best identify Canadian products made by Canadian companies?
Canada is quietly but confidently waging an economic war in which there are no shots fired, but billions in losses. This is more than a boycott. It is a social movement, an ideology, and perhaps a harbinger of the end of the single North American market. Buy Canadian, a slogan that at first seemed like a harmless hashtag, has now become the catalyst for a systemic crisis. Canadians are turning away from American goods en masse, not because they are bad, but because they are not theirs. Because every dollar spent on imports is perceived as a blow to their own future.
I'm trying to figure out why this grocer didn't label the Old Dutch as Canadian. They're definitely a Canadian-owned and operated brand. All the Frito-Lay chips get the Canadian treatment. I mean, Frito-Lay kind of owns the oil. And maybe they are made in Canada, but ultimately, this is a U.S. company. The profits go to America. So you got to look a little harder.
Supermarkets are rethinking their logistics, retailers are reviewing contracts, and American manufacturers are losing access to a market that was considered stable and profitable just a year ago. Sales of American goods in Canada have plummeted by almost a third. Broken contracts, idle warehouses, trucks stuck at the border for weeks. Some shipments are being returned, others are being destroyed. Hundreds of companies in the US are scaling back production, and thousands of workers have been sent on unpaid leave. At the same time, Canada is rapidly strengthening its market, from breweries in Quebec to farmers in Alberta.
To the extent can they be called a product of Canada, which is essentially almost 100%, or only a made in Canada product, or even just prepared, or nothing at all. And that's madeinca.ca is one of those, Shop Canadian or Buy Beaver or apps that are free or low price that are really useful for that kind of thing.
But this is only the tip of the iceberg. Underwater are destroyed agro-industrial chains, a collapse in exports of soybeans, corn and beef, a halt in rail transport, a crisis in logistics, and a shift in investment toward Europe and Asia. According to the US Department of Agriculture, the country is losing tens of billions, and farmers in the Midwest are desperately looking for new buyers. But worst of all is that trust has been lost. Canadian consumers no longer consider American products to be the best by default, and this may be irreversible.
When it comes to food, we know which brands are Canadian. And my question is, when it comes to makeup, products, or even shoes, we want to know which ones are Canadian as well.
What is behind this trade reversal? Why have Canadians suddenly started voting with their wallets against the US en masse? And what are the consequences for the economy, politics, and the future of the entire North American region? What is happening right now is not just trade statistics. It is the end of an era and the birth of a new economic reality.
So it differs for food and non-food products. So for non-food products, at least 51% needs to be Canadian designed, manufactured, assembled, the cost that go into it. For food products, it really has to be any non-zero proportion, but the last step in the process. So if I'm making a pizza, the cheese and the dough and the tomato sauce can come from anywhere, but I have to actually make it look like a pizza and package it here in Canada.
Stay with us. In this episode, we'll reveal how a simple Buy Canadian slogan turned into an economic revolution that has already collapsed entire industries in the US and may have changed the course of history.
Here's the tricky thing, though. We're seeing an increasing number of products with proudly Canadian on it, and as I understand it, that does not come with a specific meaning.
At first glance, it looked like a short-lived surge of patriotic sentiment. A couple of posts on social media, a few viral videos with the hashtag #BuyCanadian, and interviews with farmers urging people to support their own. However, after a few weeks, it became clear that this was not a fad or a campaign, it was a movement. A real, large-scale and controlled one. In less than a year, Buy Canadian has become a socio-economic phenomenon that has swept across all spheres of Canadian life, from supermarket shelves to the corridors of Parliament in Ottawa.
There are products here like shoes or apparel, but they're often manufactured overseas, and there are very few. Canada Goose is probably one of the only ones that do everything here in Canada. What I would suggest is there are these great Canadian-made websites and apps. There are 5 or 6 apps now that you can use that are crowdsourced. They use AI to develop lists of all kinds of products that give you information from a huge range of categories.
The movement grew against the backdrop of heightened trade tensions between Canada and the United States. It all started when Washington imposed new tariffs on Canadian aluminum and lumber, which sparked a wave of outrage among the Canadian public. But unlike in previous years, when such conflicts were limited to negotiations in the corridors of power, this time ordinary consumers reacted to the situation. A survey conducted by the Ledger Agency at the end of the year showed that more than 71% of Canadians said they would consciously choose locally produced products, even if they were more expensive or inferior in taste. This contrasts sharply with previous years, when the number of patriotic shoppers barely exceeded 40%. The first tangible sign was a change in the product range at the country's largest grocery chains. Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys, retail giants that control more than 80% of Canada's food market, began to revise their supply policies almost simultaneously. According to an internal document leaked to the press, Loblaws management approved a plan in April to reduce dependence on U.S. imports by 60% by the end of the year. The priority is local producers, mainly from the provinces of Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. New packaging with the words "Made in Canada" and a maple leaf began to appear on store shelves, a bright, memorable signal to shoppers. These products were promoted aggressively. Price tags, banners, salesperson recommendations. The level of national identity in retail reached the point where simply buying oil or cookies became an act of political statement.
Most in demand and the hardest ones to replace from the U.S. is typically berries, citrus, and greens, lettuce.
If there is produce from the U.S. and produce from Canada, and they're the same, of course, I'll go Canadian, of course.
Anyone who thinks that this only affected large chains is deeply mistaken. As soon as Buy Canadian began to bring commercial dividends, the wave spread to small and medium-sized businesses. Owners of small shops, stalls, and neighborhood chains were faced with a choice: either follow the new trend or become sellouts trading in foreign goods. As a result, a hasty review of product ranges began across the country. American brands were being pushed out not by law, but by public opinion. Social media was flooded with exposed videos. Users filmed which stores were still selling American goods and which were supporting our own. One such video, in which activists placed only Canadian products on the checkout counter and refused to buy American goods, garnered more than 4 million views in 48 hours. At the same time, American suppliers began to lose ground, whereas previously signing a contract with one of the largest chains automatically guaranteed access to the entire Canadian market. Now this opportunity has simply disappeared. Hundreds of long-term agreements were terminated early. Some were terminated on the initiative of the Canadian side, others by tacit mutual agreement when it became clear that there would be no demand. According to the North American Exporters Association, in 2025, the volume of consumer goods exports from the US to Canada fell by 31.7%, a record decline in the history of observations.
And actually, the response on the markets has not been as severe as many people had predicted. After the initial kind of, calamitous falls of the stock markets and the rise in the bond markets, things seem to have calmed down, and now the stock market in the US certainly is booming.
The reaction of logistics operators was not long in coming. Warehouses in border areas such as Buffalo, Detroit, and Port Huron were filled with unsold goods. Trucks that delivered products to shopping centers in Toronto or Montreal turned back, often without even unloading. One of the major carriers, Cross Lake Freight, reported that it was forced to dispose of 1,200 tons of American snacks and beverages in a single month because stores refused to accept them and it became uneconomical to store them. Businesses geared toward long-term stability found themselves in a position of frozen imports when the usual mechanisms no longer worked and new ones had not yet been established. Some American companies tried to fight back. PepsiCo, for example, proposed launching a special Canadian line of beverages adapted to local tastes and labeled to emphasize Canadian participation in production. However, this attempt was perceived as manipulation. A social media scandal exposing the fact that Canadian Pepsi is produced at a plant in New York State sparked a new wave of negativity. As a result, the company was forced to shut down the project and cut production at 2 plants in Tennessee and Ohio.
Well, it looks like it is. In fact, of course, if you look back at what the US has been doing for quite some time, they have been becoming more and more protectionist, and in different presidents as well. So it's not just Trump, although now it has accelerated.
The situation in the premium brand segment looks even more dramatic. Products from iconic brands such as Jack Daniel's, Hershey's, and Heinz, once the benchmark for quality and American cultural expansion, have been boycotted. According to representatives of the distributor Maple North, large chains even refuse to accept promotional batches of these goods so as not to provoke negative reactions from buyers. Social pressure combined with political rhetoric did its job. Being American means being a stranger. All this has led to far-reaching consequences that are now being felt throughout the entire economic structure. Dozens of American manufacturers were left without a market. Some, in an attempt to reorient themselves toward Asian markets, began urgent negotiations with distributors in South Korea and Vietnam. Others, especially small businesses, simply closed down. Meanwhile, in Canada, active substitution was underway. New brands that had previously been unable to break into the market were given a chance. In Alberta, more than 200 new food companies focused exclusively on the domestic market have been registered in the last 6 months. In response, the government announced a $250 million grant program for manufacturers wishing to expand their capacity in 2026. Thus, Buy Canadian can no longer be perceived as a spontaneous reaction to US foreign policy. It is a new ideology of consumption that has absorbed patriotism, economic pragmatism, and the desire for national independence. It is a weapon without armies, but with a powerful destructive effect. And the first crack it caused was not in the store shelves, but in the system of trust that had been the foundation of North American integration for decades.
Key trading partner, China, which, of course, at one stage the United States was threatening to impose tariffs of 145% on. Well, since then, there's been a trade negotiation truce, if you like. Those negotiations, key negotiations, due to continue in a few weeks' time.
While the boycott of American goods turned out to be an economic challenge for retail chains and consumer brands, it was a real disaster for the US agricultural sector. The Canadian market, which had long been considered a guaranteed outlet for American farmers, literally collapsed in a matter of months. According to the US Department of Agriculture, agricultural exports to Canada fell by more than $19 billion last year, the lowest figure in 15 years. But it's not even about the numbers. The very structure of dependence on the Canadian market turned out to be so deep that American agriculture, especially in the Midwest, suddenly found itself in the position of a defenseless giant that had been cut off from air. Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, the so-called grain belt of the United States, has turned into an economic disaster zone. Warehouses in agricultural districts are filled to capacity. Millions of tons of soybeans, corn, and chilled beef cannot find a way out of the country. Taking into account logistics costs, seasonal spoilage, and the lack of contracts, a significant portion of the 2025 harvest was either processed into biofuel at a minimal price or destroyed. In Hamilton County, Nebraska, alone, farmers reported disposing of 160,000 tons of feed corn due to a complete halt in external supplies. No one was buying it, not Canada, not Mexico, not China, because the previously agreed volumes had already been fulfilled. Everyone was counting on their northern neighbors, and everyone miscalculated.
So we're in a campaign right now. The elections in Canada are on April 28th. The Prime Minister Carney, and President Trump had a first phone call. We said that
Soybean producers were hit particularly hard. Last year, Canada purchased more than $4 billion worth of this crop from the US, but in 2025, supply volumes fell by almost half. And it's not just about the boycott. Canadian agricultural cooperatives, with the support of the state, have sharply increased their own production. New processing facilities were built in Ontario and Manitoba, and federal subsidies kept prices below market levels, stimulating domestic consumption. As a result, Canada's domestic market became closed, while the US market became oversaturated. Soybean prices on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange fell to an 8-year low in June, and farmers began selling off equipment and laying off seasonal workers. The American Farm Bureau Federation said that more than 125,000 jobs across the country were at risk, and these figures may be underestimated.
It's not the only irritant for Donald Trump. Canada's supply management system has been criticized for years.
The situation in the meat industry is no less dramatic. According to unofficial data, 47 meat processing plants in Texas and Oklahoma had closed by July 2025. The main reason was the cancellation of long-term contracts with Canadian retailers and food service providers. Steakhouses in Montreal, which a year ago offered juicy USDA prime, now proudly advertise 100% Canadian beef produced in Alberta. For American producers, this is not just competition, it is expulsion from a market they have relied on for decades.
Canada and the U.S. are once again talking trade after Ottawa pulled the digital services tax, but...
And while the direct economic loss is a problem that could still be solved, the destruction of infrastructure at Novum is already a systemic crisis. Canadian processors are abandoning not only American raw materials, but also the suppliers associated with them, manufacturers of fertilizers, agricultural equipment, and packaging materials. The domino effect has hit the entire vertical. For example, Kansas-based Aerocrop Systems, the largest manufacturer of agricultural drones, announced a 70% reduction in staff due to declining demand for spraying drones used on export-oriented farms. And in Iowa, River Grain, a grain drying and storage company, reported a 64% drop in capacity utilization and suspended construction of a new terminal designed specifically for Canadian shipments.
And you hear it anecdotally, either Canadians staying in Canada for vacation or going to somewhere else like Europe.
But the blow to the US economy did not end there. Following agriculture, the food and alcohol industries, traditionally strong export sectors, were also hit hard. In particular, the US has been a leader in wine, beer, and soft drink exports to Canada for decades. However, the situation has changed dramatically over the past year. According to official data, imports of American wines and beer to Canada have fallen by more than 35%, the sharpest decline in 2 decades. And while Canadian store shelves used to be lined with bottles of Jack Daniel's, Budweiser, and California's Zinfandel, today it's increasingly common to see local alternatives with maple leaves and proudly Canadian labels.
Yes, it's been a very tense time for the manufacturers here, Ty, because Thailand was slow to get its negotiations going.
Wineries in the Niagara region have reported record sales. According to the Canadian Vintners Association, in the first half of 2025, domestic consumption of Canadian wine grew by 22% and exports by 14%, partly due to contracts with European and Asian markets that had previously been focused on California. The launch of the new Niagara North Reserve line, promoted as a patriotic response to imported wine, proved particularly successful. The campaign was accompanied by active social advertising and, as a result, displaced more than a third of American brands from key sales points in Toronto and Ottawa.
It's been amazing what's happened. Sometimes you have to mix it up a little bit.
The situation with beer is developing similarly. Budweiser, Miller, and Coors, once the undisputed leaders on Canadian store shelves, are rapidly losing market share. Instead, local craft brands such as Red Leaf Brewing, Alberta Grain, and Maritime Hops Company are growing in popularity. Some of them could not even dream of federal distribution before, but today they are signing deals with the largest chains, displacing American competitors. Canadian bars and pubs have also caught the wave. Dozens of establishments in Montreal, Halifax, and Vancouver have announced a complete transition to a national assortment. American companies, meanwhile, are recording losses. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, soft drink manufacturers lost more than $4.3 billion in the first half of the year alone. Coca-Cola's Tennessee plant and PepsiCo's Kentucky plant reduced production by 28% and 32%, respectively. In response, layoffs began. According to the industry union, in June 2025 alone, More than 9,000 employees of companies focused on exports to Canada lost their jobs. The situation looks particularly alarming for small and medium-sized producers. Companies with one or two export markets, among which Canada was key, found themselves effectively pushed out of the market with no chance of recovery. Some do not have the infrastructure to reorient themselves to domestic demand, while others do not have the capital to enter Asian or European markets. Stories of bankruptcies of breweries in Missouri, family wineries in Oregon, and bottling companies in Vermont have become commonplace in the business news.